And Dr. Wright also had held various administrative positions in different institutions, with his last one for 14 years as president of Prairie View A&M University, a historically Black college and the second oldest public institution of higher education in the state of Texas. And he has actually also authored 3 books on race relations. Dr. Wright actually just recently was inducted to UK's College of Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame. And he was also the recipient of Duke University's 2021 Distinguished Alumni Award. So Dr. Wright actually tonight joins us from Zoom because he is in the middle of traveling, but he still agrees to help us introduce our tonight's important speaker. So we thank him for his support. And Dr. Wright, now I'm handing the Zoom floor to you.
Thank you. Good evening. As was mentioned, I'm George Wright, and I'm serving as the interim vice president of the Office of Institutional Diversity, and I'm also serving as the lead in the university's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan. I am a scholar of race relations, of the historical and cultural relationships between Black and white in the United States. Among other things, I've done research on racial violence. After publishing 3 books on that topic of race relations, racial discrimination, and racial violence, I decided that I needed to understand these issues in a larger context than just the United States. And it led to me over a 15-year period going abroad, going to Europe, going to South America, going to Africa, going to Asia. I would go to China on 10 different occasions to do research. My work on UK's DE&I plan has led to me meeting and learning from one of the people on our leadership team. This is Dr. Wajin Maskey, who just made a few comments, but if you will, I would like to say a few things about Dr. Maskey before I mention our keynote speaker tonight. Born and raised in China, Dr. Maskey received her BA and MA from Beijing University and received her PhD in Chinese art history from Oxford University in England. She then taught in the Boston area for some 15 years, where she founded the Chinese language and cultural program in the Brookline public school system. She also devoted time to educating high school teachers in that area on how to teach Chinese, and she led dozens of study trips to China for New England educators. Very important activities. Maskey was the founding director of the award-winning University of Kentucky Confucius Institute for the past 11 years. She is currently the executive director of UK's Office of China Initiative. She leads the university effort in all China-related partnerships and programs. Dr. Maskey also holds the rank of clinical associate professor in the College of Education. Recently, in a conversation with Dr. Maskey, and we've had conversations from September to the present, I asked her, what do I and others here in the United States need to understand about the plight, about what Asian Americans and Asian internationals are experiencing in this nation of ours? She replied, and I'm quoting Dr. Maskey, I think the biggest challenge facing the Asian American community is for the general public and for the campus to know that there were, she says in bold letters, and are, she says in bold letters, discrimination and prejudice against AAPI community locally. Asian Americans strongly believe, Dr. Maskey said, that their voices need to be heard. Then she went further. She reminded me of things that I had read about in my undergraduate college courses and had reinforced in my work on racial balance. She reminded me of the long, tragic, and brutal history of discrimination and violence in the United States against people from Asia. Sounds very much like what many African Americans experienced in the South. And she pointed out that this started in the 1860s and 1870s, or more than 100 years ago. In other words, UK community, I've learned a lot. I've had a lot reinforced by my interacting with Dr. Maskey, and I thank her for that, and I thank her for the role that she is playing in our DEI plan. She has reminded us that even though we may have started with looking at African American and Latino Americans, that we need to look at all Americans, and we also need to look at internationals as well. It is also my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Dan Wu. He, like Dr. Maskey, was born in China, and he eventually moved to the United States as a young person, and I find very interesting the places that he has lived. I don't think I've known someone who has lived in Fargo, North Dakota, and San Francisco, and New York City. Those are some very places to live. Mr. Wu now calls Lexington home, just like I do after having been to some other places. He and he is doing something that I would love to be doing as well. He is a professional cook. My wife constantly tells me that I'm a short order cook, that all I do is fry things. Well, that's not the case with Mr. Wu. Over the last decade, he has created a diverse repertoire of delicious food for private clients, for street fairs, for his own restaurant, Atomic Ramen, and on the campus here at UK. At the same time, he is a fierce defender of immigrants and refugees and social justice. I just mentioned how I wish I was a cook like him. I hope Mr. Wu will appreciate that he and I share some other things in common, that he is a reader of comic books. From the time that I was 10 or 12 years old, I've been reading Mad Magazine, a comic book. It also says that he loves movies. I love looking at all sorts of movies. And this last one, again, my wife can vouch for. It says that he is a potato chip connoisseur. I am a potato chip eater in that regard. So I have a lot with Mr. Wu in common. It is such an honor to introduce you, sir. I will now turn the program over to you. Again, it is an honor for me to be at this program this evening. Thank you.
Actually, who's voted 10 best and the 10 best faculty for over executive 12 years. And Dr. Wright also had held various administrative positions in different institutions, with his last one for 14 years as president of Prairie View A&M University, a historically Black college and the second oldest public institution of higher education in the state of Texas. And he has actually also authored 3 books on race relations. Dr. Wright actually just recently was inducted to UK's College of Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame. He was also the recipient of Duke University's 2021 Distinguished Alumni Award. So Dr. Wright actually tonight joins us from Zoom because he is in the middle of traveling, but he still agrees to help us introduce our tonight's important speaker. So we thank him for his support. And Dr. Wright, now I'm handing the Zoom floor to you.
Thank you. Good evening. As was mentioned, I'm George Wright, and I'm serving as the interim vice president of the Office of Institutional Diversity and I'm also serving as the lead in the university's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan. I am a scholar of race relations, of the historical and cultural relationships between Black and white in the United States. Among other things, I've done research on racial violence. After publishing 3 books on that topic of race relations, racial discrimination, and racial violence, I decided that I needed to understand these issues in a larger context than just the United States. And it led to me over a 15-year period going abroad, going to Europe, going to South America, going to Africa, going to Asia. I would go to China on 10 different occasions to do research. My work on UK's DE&I plan has led to me meeting and learning from one of the people on our leadership team. This is Dr. Wajid Maskey, who just made a few comments, but if you will, I would like to say a few things about Dr. Maskey before I mention our keynote speaker tonight. Born and raised in China, Dr. Maskey received her BA and MA from Beijing University and received her PhD in Chinese art history from Oxford University in England. She then taught in the Boston area for some 15 years, where she founded the Chinese language and cultural program in the Brookline public school system. She also devoted time to educating high school teachers in that area on how to teach Chinese, and she led dozens of study trips to China for New England educators. Very important activities. Maskey was the founding director of the award-winning University of Kentucky Confucius Institute for the past 11 years. She is currently the executive director of UK's Office of China Initiative. She leads the university effort in all China-related partnerships and programs. Dr. Maskey also holds the rank of clinical associate professor in the College of Education. Recently, in a conversation with Dr. Maskey, and we've had conversations from September to the present, I asked her, what do I and others here in the United States need to understand about the plight, about what Asian Americans and Asian internationals are experiencing in this nation of ours? She replied, and I'm quoting Dr. Maskey, I think the biggest challenge facing the Asian American community is for the general public and for the campus to know that there were, she says in bold letters, and are, she says in bold letters, discrimination and prejudice against AAPI community locally. Asian Americans strongly believe, Dr. Maskey said, that their voices need to be heard. Then she went further. She reminded me of things that I had read about in my undergraduate college courses and had reinforced in my work on racial balance. She reminded me of the long, tragic, and brutal history of discrimination and violence in the United States against people from Asia. Sounds very much like what many African Americans experienced in the South. And she pointed out that this started in the 1860s and 1870s, or more than 100 years ago. In other words, UK community, I've learned a lot. I've had a lot reinforced by my interacting with Dr. Maskey. And I thank her for that. And I thank her for the role that she is playing in our DEI plan. She has reminded us that even though we may have started with looking at African American and Latino Americans, that we need to look at all Americans, and we also need to look at internationals as well. It is also my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Dan Wu. He, like Dr. Maskey, was born in China, and he eventually moved to the United States as a young person, and I find very interesting the places that he has lived. I don't think I've known someone who has lived in Fargo, North Dakota, and San Francisco, and New York City. Those are some varied places to live. Mr. Wu now calls Lexington home, just like I do after having been to some other places. He and he is doing something that I would love to be doing as well. He is a professional cook. My wife constantly tells me that I'm a short order cook, that all I do is fry things. Well, that's not the case with Mr. Wu. Over the last decade, he has created a diverse repertoire of delicious food for private clients, for street fairs, for his own restaurant, Atomic Ramen, and on the campus here at UK. At the same time, he is a fierce defender of immigrants and refugees and social justice. I've just mentioned how I wish I was a cook like him. I hope Mr. Wu will appreciate that he and I share some other things in common, that he is a reader of comic books. From the time that I was 10 or 12 years old, I've been reading Mad Magazine, a comic book. It also says that he loves movies. I love looking at all sorts of movies. And this last one, again, my wife can vouch for. It says that he is a potato chip connoisseur. I am a potato chip eater in that regard. So I have a lot with Mr. Wu in common. It is such an honor to introduce you, sir. I will now turn the program over to you. Again, it is an honor for me to be at this program this evening. Thank you.
All right. Zoom stuff, right? Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the UK Office of China Initiatives, Dr. Huajin Maskey, and thank you to Dr. George Wright for that great introduction. Thank you all for being here, those of you in person, and thank you all in Zoom land for tuning in as well. Those of you in the room get a special treat because I'm going to do a little audience participation a little bit later on, so get ready. To be honest, it feels a little weird standing up here in front of a desk in a UK classroom. I am by no means an academic. In fact, I am the first man in my family in 4 generations to not have a PhD. I am, however, a chef. I'm a small business owner. I'm a local organizer and activist. I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I'm a son. I'm a first generation immigrant. I came here as a kid at 8 years old. Some people would call that 1.5 generation, so kind of in between, not quite born here, but not quite coming here as an adult. Because of that, I straddle 2 cultures. I am Chinese because of where I was born and the parents that I was born to. I'm an American because this is where I've spent most of my life. I grew up translating for my parents, reading utility bills for them, taking off my shoes at home, eating Chinese food for almost every meal, except those times where we would get KFC as a treat. Out in the world as a kid, I played Dungeons and Dragons, I grew my hair out long, I read comic books, and I listened to heavy metal. I'm what you call a third culture kid, and I think some of you here can relate to that idea. When I look back on my childhood, I sometimes wonder how much of it was the very specific childhood of Dan Wu, born to parents Xiaolin, later Charlene Wu, and Fang Cheng, later Frank Wu. And how much of this life was like the life of every Asian kid in America. I came to the States in 1982, over 150 years after the first Chinese man set foot in this country. We landed in an airport in Fargo, North Dakota. They arrived by boat in the California coast. We were all seeking our fortunes. When gold was first discovered at Sutter's Mill in California in 1854, it didn't take very long for the news of it to arrive to China. Now, China at this time were suffering from the aftermath of the defeat of the Opium War. Not only did they lose blood, they lost dignity, they lost money, and they lost land to the colonial British Empire and a little thing called Hong Kong. So the people of China desperately needed a new life and a new opportunity. And for a lot of them, it laid across the Pacific in Jinshan, or Gold Mountain. So in the next few years, tens of thousands of Chinese men came to California to seek their fortune. But instead of a mountain of gold, what they found facing them were laws, taxes, and violence. Once the gold mines dried up, many went to work for the Transcontinental Railroad, making up 90% of that workforce. In the biggest infrastructure project of that day, nearly 700 miles of rail connected the country together and kind of made the US what it is today. With very few other options, other Chinese men set up shops such as restaurants, laundries, and other women's work. Echoing the popular anti-Chinese sentiment of the day, Horace Greeley, founder and editor of the New York Daily Tribune, wrote this about the Chinese in 1854. They are, for the most part, an industrious people, forbearing and patient of injury, quiet and peaceable in their habits. Say this, and you have said all good that can be said of them. They are uncivilized, unclean, filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations, lustful and sensual in their dispositions. Every female is a prostitute of the basest order. The first words of English they learn are terms of obscenity and profanity. And beyond this, they care to learn no more. And you see this in the very beginning of our history in this country, the intertwining of the two dominant views of the Chinese and later all Asians in America for the next 150 years. The yellow peril and the model minority, two sides of the same racist coin. All right, let's do some quick definitions. The yellow peril was a late 19th century idea about the faceless, nameless hordes of yellow people from the Asia Pacific that would, by sheer numbers, overwhelm white and European nations, cultures, values, and civilization itself. The model minority myth, on the other hand, saw Jews and Asians as smart, industrious, law-abiding, productive members of society, and certainly superior to all those other minorities, you know, Blacks and Latinos. You combine these two pernicious ideas and you have the racist American view of Asians in this country. Nameless, faceless, voiceless, perpetually foreign, but also good in school, quiet, successful, non-threatening. Back in the yellow peril days of the late 1800s, poor and out of work whites blamed the economic woes on the Chinese workers with their strange customs, their strange clothes, and worst of all, their willingness to work for less pay. The Chinese were brutalized by the 1-2 punch of physical and emotional violence, as well as legal and legislative violence. Hundreds of Chinese men were killed, lynched, and driven wholesale out of entire towns and counties in California. On top of that, law after law targeted and taxed them, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which slowed Chinese immigration down to a trickle for the next 80 years. It wasn't until the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965 that reopened the doors to this land of opportunity. Not coincidentally, it was the mid-60s that saw the introduction of the idea of the model minority. In her book, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, Kathy Park Hong explained it beautifully. Back then, only select professionals from Asia were granted visas to the United States: doctors, engineers, mechanics. The screening process, by the way, is how the whole model minority quackery began. The US government only allowed for the most educated and highly trained Asians in, and then took all the credit for their success. See, anyone can live the American dream, they would say about a doctor who came into this country already a doctor. So some of you might be asking, what is so wrong with being seen as smart and successful, law-abiding, productive members of society? What's wrong with that? All right, so we're gonna do a little audience participation. I'm gonna need your help. We're gonna break this thing down, okay? Smart. What kind of smart? Anybody? Math and science. What else? Yeah, book smart, exactly. Math, science, engineering, medicine. Can we be artists? Can we be athletes?
No.
How about rappers?
No.
Politicians?
No.
No. Successful. What does successful mean in this context?
A lot of money.
A lot of money. What else? Prestige. Business ownership, right? But what kind of businesses are we talking about?
Restaurants.
Restaurants. What else?
Beauty.
Beauty, laundromats. What else?
Service restaurants.
Service restaurants. What about law offices? How about gyms? Asian-owned landscaping companies, maybe?
Have something to do with martial arts stuff.
Martial arts gym. There you go. What about a photography studio?
No.
Clothing boutique? No? And law abiding. What does law abiding mean? Quiet, right? Do we report crimes?
No.
Right? Do we call the police when things are happening to us? No. And lastly, productive. What is productive in this society? What's that?
Workaholic.
Workaholic, working, right? We're valued for our labor. So all these positive attributes, they're coded. When we don't control our own narrative and our own sense of identity, we are saddled with these stereotypes. Another reason the model minority is a myth is because all these positive socioeconomic stats that you hear, they hide really wide disparities between different groups in the AAPI community. Asian Americans taken as a whole, we have higher incomes, higher percentage of bachelor degrees and advanced degrees, and professional employment. But let's take median household income as an example. While the overall number is higher than average, in the Nepalese, Burmese, and Hmong communities, they earn 2 to 3 times less than those in the Indian and Filipino communities. The same goes for rates of poverty, education, and English proficiency. And a lot of these differences have to do with how and when we arrived to this country. The groups at the bottom of all of these measures, they are recent arrivals, and many of them refugees, these newest Americans. When we think of Asian professions, what do we think of? Scientists. What else? Doctors, engineers. But many of us are in fact restaurant workers, salon workers, housekeepers, factory workers, service industry work where the wages are as low as the respect. So let's be honest here. I'm talking to a room of, I would say, majority Asian Americans. Many of us, and I say us, many of us Asian Americans have bought into this myth and sinker. In pursuit of the lofty ideals has created untold pressures on ourselves and our kids. What if we can't live up to this model minority? What if we can't get into Princeton or Stanford or UCLA? What if we don't end up as doctors and engineers? Well, your tiger mom sure as hell gonna help you get there. Coined by Yale Law School professor and author Amy Chua in her 2011 memoir, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, tiger parenting became yet another cultural issue that highlighted the potentially self-fulfilling prophecy of developing academically excellent, but socially and spiritually deficient kids. By the way, not surprisingly, one of her daughters is a Yale law grad, and the other one is currently studying law at Harvard. Now, is this because of Asians' natural intelligence and aptitude? Is it because of Amy's tiger parenting? Or is it because legacy admissions is where Ivy Leagues typically admit kids of alumni at 2 to 5 times the rate of other students? On top of all of that pressure, saddled with all these stories of success and virtue, the racism and discrimination that we face is diminished, if not ignored. Yes, we've been insulted. Yes, we've been beaten. And yes, we've been killed. But so much of what we face in this country in the form of discrimination is microaggressions. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. Cuts so small, we feel stupid complaining about it. So let's do a little informal survey of the Asian folks in this room, okay? I want a show of hands if someone who didn't know you assumed you were smart. Show of hands. Got a few hands here. How many people have other people assumed were good at math before they knew you at all? They just assumed, yeah, you're obviously good at math. Help me with this. How many people have encountered people who assumed, without knowing you, that you didn't speak English? How many people, once they started talking to you, complimented you on how good your English was? Oh, your English is excellent. When you introduce yourself and you tell them your name, how many of you have encountered people who say, oh, do you know David Wu or Steve Kim or Susie Nguyen? You know, right? Your name is, you're Vietnamese, right? Yeah. How many have been in a conversation where out of nowhere they relate that they have an adopted Korean kid or their best friend is from Cambodia? How many of you out of nowhere in a conversation, they tell you about their vacation to Thailand or the time they went to India for no reason? How many of you out of nowhere, they tell you how much they love Kung Fu or anime or mochi or ramen? How many of you have been assumed to be the help in a situation? Just yesterday, my friend Lakshmi posted on her Facebook. She said she went to a restaurant to pick up food and they asked if she was a DoorDash driver, and it's not the first time that it's happened to her. And she's South Asian American. How many of you as adults or as kids have been made fun of for the way you look, for your face, for the way you dress, for your hair? How many of you have heard ching chong noises at you? Or people saying just absolute gibberish, thinking that they're communicating with you? How many of you have been called a chink, a Jap, or a gook? How many of you have been called the wrong slur? How do these comments and interactions make you feel? Smaller, worthless? Yeah. It's not just in the everyday world that we face these microaggressions and stereotypes. They've been enforced in every aspect of our pop culture since day one. Our portrayals in the media have not only been this yellow peril model minority mashup, but also the simultaneous sexualization of the Asian woman and the emasculation of the Asian man. In the 1800s, the vast majority of Chinese immigrants were single men, men who were shorter in stature, wearing long ponytails called queues, and dressed in robes instead of shirts and pants. Add to that the lack of language ability and their place in the lowest rungs of American hierarchy. It was very easy for Americans to see them as less than men, even though they worked on the gold mines and the railroads, some of the hardest labor ever. Not to mention the laws that on one hand prevented their wives and other Chinese women from immigrating to the US, and at the same time, miscegenation laws prevented them from marrying white women. The Chinese man was to remain sexless. This lack of sexuality and masculinity extends from early depictions like Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan, two perfect examples, by the way, of the yellow peril model minority dichotomy, all the way to today. When a smoldering Stephen Young on the cover of GQ feels revolutionary, you know we have a long way to go. Meanwhile, the few early Chinese women settlers had scant opportunities outside of sex work, and they were very quickly sexualized and fetishized, not just as objects of desire and conquest, but also immoral corruptors of pure white values. This trope manifested itself in the lotus blossom dragon lady dichotomy. You're either a submissive sexual object to be seduced and conquered, or a cold and cunning sexual predator. In fact, the precursor to the Chinese Exclusion Act was the Page Act of 1875 that explicitly sought to bar, quote unquote, immoral Chinese women. With this history, is it any wonder that the Atlanta murderer, claiming to have a sex addiction, specifically targeted Asian women? Beyond what was happening at home, America was expanding its empire into the Philippines and the Pacific Islands. not to mention Hawaii. Consider also that our last 3 major wars have been fought against Asian countries: Japan, Korea, Vietnam. These wars not only reinforced the American psyche, the idea of the yellow peril and its danger to Western civilization, but also created legacies from the American servicemen's encounters with Asian women in these countries and the children they left behind. The adoption of Korean and Vietnamese children by Americans in later years created its own complex set of stories of assimilation and erasure. After Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. And that's what they are. They're not interned. They were not evacuated. These were concentration camps. Because of the fear of the loyalty or the disloyalty of Japanese Americans, they could not be trusted. We were and we are the perpetual foreigner, the yellow peril within our very midst. Once the wars ended, we took on an old enemy, but in a new arena. The 80s and 90s saw fierce competition with an ascendant Japan, a quieter, more insidious threat based on technology and innovation. The model minority as a foreign threat. This resentment was made visceral and lethal with the 1982 murder of Vincent Chen, a Chinese-American draftsman. He was out for his bachelor party. He was murdered by 2 white auto workers. The murderers yelled anti-Japanese racial slurs as they beat him to death with a baseball bat. 8 days before Vincent was to be married. This murder predated hate crime laws in America. The 2 men were sentenced to 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine. That's what our lives are worth. Presiding Circuit Judge Charles Kaufman said, quote, "These weren't the kind of men you send to jail. You don't make the punishment fit the crime. You make the punishment fit the criminal." Today, the fear of China has turned into a fear of today, the fear of Japan, has turned into a fear of the rising China, a quickly advancing superpower threatening to challenge, if not America itself, at least the idea of American exceptionalism. Yellow peril in the 21st century. It didn't help that our last president seemed obsessed with China as our greatest enemy. Now, some people blame Trump for the rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. And it is true that anti-Asian and anti-immigrant rhetoric has ramped up in the last few years. But Trump is not the cause of racism and prejudice in this country. He is, if anything, a mirror that reflects back the ideas and the thoughts that have always existed within us. His Wuhan flu is just the latest version of the disease-carrying foreigner trope. His 2017 Muslim ban is just an updating of the race-based exclusion acts of the last 2 centuries. Now, a lot of us by this point have heard and read about the statistics on anti-Asian violence, up 150% in the last 12 months, nearly 3,800 reported cases. Reported cases, because Asian Americans are the group least likely to report violent crime and hate crimes. So we know the number is far greater. And I'll admit this, I didn't pay that much attention to these statistics. I didn't pay that much attention to these reports. Not just because they were kind of scattered one-off incidents that rarely involved death, but in light of the police killings and the hate crimes committed against Black men and women in 2020 and all the years before, it felt simply not important enough to complain about. I mean, what is our suffering compared to that? What are microaggressions and isolated incidents and isolated attacks compared to systemic racism and violence and murder faced by Black Americans every single day? It took the horrific, racist, misogynistic murders in Atlanta to kind of shake me from that notion, to remind me that this is not the oppression Olympics, that more justice for Black folks isn't less justice for Asians. And the scarcity mindset is a tool of white supremacy and systemic racism. We as marginalized communities have been conditioned to live with the scarcity. A scarcity of representation where any TV show or movie can only have one token minority character. A scarcity of opportunity, both academically and professionally and economically. And a scarcity of justice where there just simply doesn't seem to be enough of it to go around for all of us. And so we're forced to compete. We're forced to compete for admissions, for jobs, for attention, for media representation, for sympathy, and for justice. This zero-sum game forces us as marginalized communities to hoard whatever we can get to the detriment of solidarity and empathy. When we talk about systemic racism, the key word for me is systemic. It is not just individual people or laws that are racist. It is the system itself. When people say the system is broken, I would argue that it's working exactly as designed to keep marginalized people, whether by race, gender, sexuality, sexual identity, religion, class, or any other social marker, to keep us on the margins. And its greatest weapon is and has always been its uncanny ability to keep us divided and fighting each other for scraps. And the only way to defeat such a system is through coalition and solidarity. Throughout our history, although rare and rarely talked about, these coalitions have existed. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists like Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and Richard Aoki, and many others worked in solidarity with the Black Power movement to advance human rights. Richard Aoki, the only Asian American to have a formal leadership role with the Black Panther Party, wrote this in 1968. We Asian Americans believe that American society has been, and still is, fundamentally a racist society, and that historically we have accommodated ourselves to this society in order to survive. Not coincidentally, this was the same year Asian American was coined. Before this, we were called Oriental. The idea of yellow peril for Black power began then and has seen a revival in recent years in the Black Lives Matter movement. So more and more Asian Americans have been waking up to the true nature of white supremacy. And unlike many of our parents and grandparents, we are louder and more visible when it comes to calls for justice. Comedian and host Hassan Minhaj wrote in 2018, "My dad's from that generation like a lot of immigrants where he feels like if you come to this country, you pay this thing called the American dream tax. Like you're gonna endure some racism. And if it doesn't cost you your life, well, hey, you lucked out. Pay it. There you go, Uncle Sam. I was born here, so I actually have the audacity of equality." My dad was a racist. He was a classic, we worked hard to get here, why can't they, type of first-generation immigrant. Once the door that let us in closed, he let it stay closed. He fell for the divide and conquer strategy of white supremacy, and so he never looked beyond his own community in terms of his support and empathy. He hoarded it for people who look like him, for people who look like me. Many of you, many of us, myself included, have internalized this yellow peril model minority identity. We feel entitled to our status as the good minority. We cling onto this conditional whiteness, afraid to let go of the scraps of any privilege that we're given. We stay in our lanes as doctors, scientists, engineers, and academics. We're entrepreneurs, but only in the world of ethnic cuisine and body and beauty services. We keep our heads down so our kids can go to Ivy League schools and reach their so-called American dream. We do all these things so we can stay successful, stay ahead, and stay safe. But as the murders in Atlanta have shown us so starkly and so clearly, that safety is an illusion. When we do not own our humanity and instead have to earn it through our contributions, our labor, and our subservience, we will never be free. By 2045, the US will be a majority-minority country. This means white folks will be outnumbered by non-white folks in just 24 years. But none of that means anything in the fight for racial justice if we as marginalized communities can't shed the politics of scarcity and division and work in solidarity together against white supremacy. For white Americans, it means something much simpler. Love us the way you love our culture. Value us the way you value our culture. As Naomi Osaka said in a tweet last month, if people loved Asian people as much as they love bubble tea, anime, mochi, sushi, matcha, etc., imagine profiting and enjoying things that come from a culture and then attacking and diminishing the ethnic group that created it. And that goes double when it comes to Black contributions, because there is no American culture without Black culture. Naomi Osaka, who is of Haitian and Japanese ancestry, is a 23-year-old tennis phenom. Last year, she wore 7 different face masks for the 7 matches that she was to play for the tournament at the 2020 US Open. The masks bore the names of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and other victims of police and racial violence. Oh, by the way, she won that tournament. Naomi Osaka didn't stay in her lane. She used her platform to speak out passionately and unapologetically for all people. Now that's my kind of model minority. Thank you.
I'm going to stay here, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'll take this off.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you very much, Dan, for that, I would say, very thought-provoking talk, bringing us from the type of racism during the yellow peril time to right now, right in front of us. And you actually brought us, can you guys hear me? You actually brought us through these 180 some years, 170, 180 years period of the time, even though nowadays the model minority is actually the same racism in different manifestations, I would say, different ways, subtle ways. So I want to go ahead. I'm sure there are lots of questions from our audience here, and also we have questions from the Q&A here. I want to open up for questions, if you will. I want to give you more time. So first of all, I want to ask the people here for you to prepare your questions, but I do have questions from our Q&A. I'm going to ask you, Dan. So one of the questions says, how can non-Asian Americans support all Asians and help combat the inequality?
Yeah, that's the question, right? That's the big question. I think racial justice comes from so many different levels. It comes from the government level. It comes from the justice system. It comes from the economy. It comes from schools. But I think for us here, day-to-day people, if we want to act in allyship, and I want to remind everybody that you're not an ally, you act in allyship. Ally is not a status you get to have. It's an action that you take every single day. For non-Asian folks to act in allyship, honestly, is just standing up for us. When you hear things, when people say things to you, jokes, comments that are denigrating really any marginalized community, they're talking to you because they think you're one of them and that I can say this to you, right? It's cool, right? It's not cool. Make it not cool. Make it awkward. You know what I mean? Like, trade your discomfort in that situation for our pain. That's what you all can do. Talk to your friends, talk to your relatives, as hard and awkward as those conversations are. Make it known. Those ideas, those words, and those actions, not okay.
we have we have people actually that ask us to do this often in the future, as this is so educational. So what is your thoughts? You have attended K-12 school in this country. I did it in China. So I was reflecting on my I was reflecting on my education in China, really as a Chinese, born and raised in China. In my high school curriculum, in my college curriculum, I knew nothing about Asian Americans in the United States, even in my world history class. And so I would like to, if you would please talk to us about your thoughts, on our talking about education, right? How do we, because I believe that if, we don't understand the history and how the racism has been, in history, then to many people, the Atlantic shooting is an isolated case.
Right.
It's not one more, So what's your thoughts on, our education in our curriculum?
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go with our education. The sad fact of the matter is history is written by the winners, and winner usually means oppressor, conqueror, colonizer. So if you take history from that point of view, the losers lost because they're losers, or they were in the way of progress. And you're never going to get an accurate view of it. So even if you hear about, oh, lots of Chinese folks worked on the railroads, and that's one sentence in your history book, what do you know? Do you know that hundreds of them were killed and driven away from towns? Do you know that they were paid significantly less? Do you know that they had specific taxes that taxed just them? One really interesting little factoid I found that was kind of amazing. When the Chinese started opening laundromats in San Francisco, they passed a tax, and I'll get the numbers wrong, but they would charge you $1 tax if you delivered your laundry with 1 horse. They would charge you $2 tax if you delivered your laundry with 2 horses. And then they would charge you $10 tax if you used no horses at all. Guess who used no horses at all? The Chinese. Amazing. I mean, just the creativity in the racism, in this country is kind of mind-boggling. So learn your history, but don't take that kind of stuff for granted. Howard Zinn has some really great books called like the People's History or the People's History of America, which really look at things from a working class, a street level, kind of proletariat level, not from the quote unquote winner's point of view. So you kind of have to do a little bit more digging and do a little bit more work to find the stuff out.
Thank you, Dan. We have more questions coming in here. Next one is, what role can or should a university like UK play in the local community like Lexington to work for respect and justice for diverse residents on and off campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. UK has a lot of resources. UK has money. UK has structural resources and structural advantages. They have programs. They have people who are educated in certain areas. But very often UK, and not just UK, but universities in general, they feel very separated and partitioned off from the rest of the community, right? I think UK and anybody with resources and those kind of privileges need to go out into the community and share those resources. We have people, there are resources here for incoming students from other countries, right? But are there resources in the wider community for people coming in from other countries? If I just immigrated here from whatever country as a refugee or as an immigrant, where are my resources? Who's gonna help me figure out which ESL classes to take? Who's gonna help me figure out how to navigate a grocery store? You know what I mean? Or how to read and pay my bills? All of these sort of things. There are so many basic things that we can't do until we kind of learn how to be American. And I think that's where places like UK can really come into play.
Great. This is a very specific question. We have an audience who commented, he said, that I think it's kind of a stereotype that people think Asian people don't look out for each other. How can you do better with that regard?
that it's a stereotype that Asians don't look out for each other.
Yep.
You know, for me, like, stereotypes to some degree are rooted in some nugget of truth somewhere in there. For me, when I speak to an Asian or Asian American audience, I find myself to be kind of harsher than usual, because the kind of critiques that I have for my community are the same kind of critiques that I have for myself. Like, we can do better, right? That we can be out there, that we can be supporting other communities. So it's not a specifically Asian problem, but having lived under this model minority myth, a big part of our survival is keeping our heads down and don't look that way, don't look that way. There's a protest over here. That's got nothing to do with me. I'm gonna stay here, stay safe, keep my status, right? And it's understandable. It's completely understandable to do that. It makes sense from a survival point of view to do that. But as long as you do that, you stay under this system that marginalizes and persecutes other people. And you know that saying that said, first they came for the Jews and I stayed silent, and then they came, you know, for another group and I stayed silent, and then they came for me. We can't wait for that moment. We have to step up from the beginning.
So we have a lot of questions. This is good. So you next question. You spoke. Let me
Up here. So you spoke movingly about recognizing the inherent prejudice of your parents. One, as an Asian American, question number one, as an Asian American, how did you navigate this dichotomy with as your activism grew? And question number two, how does your activist approach change when you speak to an urban white majority audience versus disenfranchised rural white people in Appalachia?
Big questions.
Great question.
Yeah, no, that's great. The first part of that question, I always found it, even though like growing up in the household that I did, even later on, I remember thinking, for me, like any sort of marginalized community, when they speak out against other marginalized communities, it always blows my mind and I don't understand it. And then when I hear about first-generation immigrants talking badly about the next generation immigrants, or, you know, it also boggles my mind. And at first I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And then it made sense, right? It's a part of your survival mechanism that you got here, you got yours, I have to protect it. And I have to protect it from anybody else who's trying to get it, because it's that scarcity mentality again. If I don't hold on to this, you're gonna get some of it and I'm gonna get less of it. So again, it's understandable. It's not good. And I think in a lot of ways, some of this change simply has to come from people from further generations. As Hassan Minhaj says, he was born here, he has the audacity of equality, because he doesn't take for granted that this is the price that we have to pay coming in here. He says, bullshit, we're not gonna put up with this. As far as talking to different audiences, that's something I think about a lot too, because as I said, you know, speaking to a more predominantly Asian audience, I'm very self-critical. I'm talking about the community. I'm talking about how we can do better. If I'm talking to an urban white audience or an educated white audience, you know, a big part of it would be honestly to kind of get off your ass and get out of your comfort zone and do the thing that's uncomfortable. Because acting in allyship is not turning your Instagram screen black for one day out of the year. And that's all you do. Or sharing one hashtag, or something bad happens and you post up a video of a person of color getting brutalized. First of all, don't fucking do that anymore. Do not post up people being killed and brutalized. Just don't do it. If we have to see somebody suffer in order to grant them their humanity, we're doing it wrong. So I would say, yeah, get out of your comfort zone, and actually to act in allyship, like you have to make some sort of sacrifice. It has to be a financial sacrifice. It has to be a personal, emotional sacrifice. You have to maybe get out of the way for somebody else to get through the door, or you hold that door open for somebody else. In terms of if I'm talking to more disadvantaged or rural white folks, I say this, you're one of us. You're a marginalized community by dint of your geography and your ancestry and your class and your poverty. You're one of us. And if we could bring these groups together, it would be so amazingly powerful. I mean, think about who did they get to break up miners' strikes in Virginia? Black people, Latino people, Italian immigrants, right? And it turned the attention of the striking miners away from the bosses to these other groups. Oh, you're taking my job, you're now the bad guy. Who did they bring in to break up strikes as scabs in California? It was the recent Chinese workers, right? So all of a sudden you turn your ire against them. So if we could bring together all these marginalized communities who sometimes don't even know they're marginalized, right? I think it would be a very powerful thing.
So Dan, as an Asian American, and as some of my Chinese teachers here visiting from China, you have mentioned in your talk that how many times were asked, oh, your English is great. Where did you learn your English? Or where are you from? Where are you really from?
Yes.
That kind of question. So really, truly, in the beginning, for me, when I heard that kind of question, I felt this is a friendly question. You know, I felt when I was asked, your English is good, I felt that it's flattered, right?
Yeah.
So this is a kind of a connected to this question that I want to ask that's from the audience. It says, when someone talks to you about a trip, right, or an anime, that they are trying to connect you as a person. So how would you treat that? Because you could see that as a microaggression.
Yeah.
You know, how would you just think, assume I'm from Thailand, right?
Yeah.
So could you speak to that a
Yeah.
little bit?
There's a very thin line between that earnest wanting to like connect with somebody and a microaggression. And here's the thing about microaggressions, almost all the time, they're not intentional. Nobody is trying to hurt your feelings when they ask you that, but they do. And it's very hard to get that across because we're talking about intent versus impact. If you're in a grocery line with me and I turn around and you say, hey, where are you from? You might be just genuinely curious, right? But for me, that question is othering. That question from you, especially as a white person or as a non-Asian person, that question says, you're different, you're strange, I need to figure out what this strangeness or this differentness is about, right? Now, the opposite of that is if an old Asian lady comes up and they'll just yell at me, be like, where are you from? You China? You Korea? And that's the exact opposite. Because what she wants to know is, can we speak the same language together? That's what it is. And it's kind of funny and jarring and direct, but it's literally the opposite of this other interaction. So I would say, if you're trying to connect with somebody, it's all about context, right? If you say, hey, I'm Dan, I'm originally from China, and then the next thing out of your mouth is like, oh, we went to Thailand on vacation last year, right? You might be trying to connect, like, oh, what do I know about Asia? Okay, Asia. And I like sushi, just like, and for us, it's that immediate, like, you don't really care. You're just trying to do this weird sort of tenuous connection. And then, of course, we're all the same. Thailand is the same thing as China. Anime is the same thing as, fried rice, whatever it is. So I think it's all about context. I think you can find all that information out, but how, in the same way that you would do it with a friend, like if you're sitting down and actually having a conversation, like, oh yeah, I first lived here and then I moved to this other place, and you moved here recently, right? Like, from where, you know what I mean? And if it's a conversation, I have no problem with that, of that sort of bonding. But it's just kind of being aware of your impact, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
Here is interesting about business. How do you see your role? How
do you see your role as a businessman and an activist? Is there any tension between these two identities, or do they work together for you?
The answer is yes. I think the old conventional wisdom is that if you're running a business, you want as many people as possible to come spend money with you, right? To buy your service, to buy your ramen, whatever it is. So you don't want to put yourself out there and be political and alienate folks. And I thought about that right before I opened my business. I was already active in the community doing things. And I thought, I asked myself, like, do I want to continue doing these things now that I have a storefront? Now, it's not just me, it's my employees, it's this whole brand. And I decided it was worth the effort, because if I put up a post about this is why you should support immigrants, and you think that's offensive, or you think that's political or alienating, I guess you can go eat somewhere else. Like, you know what I mean? And in a lot of ways, like, I will gain more followers, I think, through, having a stand, having an opinion. More people, I've gone to places, stores, or restaurants because of what they stand for more than the product itself. My favorite coffee houses, I don't know the difference between this cup of coffee and that cup of coffee. I kind of don't care, but I'll go here because every week or the third Thursday of every month, they donate X amount of money to a local nonprofit. You know what I mean? Or they have ethical hiring and staff processes, things like that. So I think those things, they make a difference, but I think it's the opposite of the conventional wisdom. I think it's a positive thing.
Thank you. Last question. Would you allow the last one or two questions?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Asian Americans can sometimes feel othered by both AAPI and white communities, especially individuals from mixed backgrounds. For example, too Asian for the white group or too Asian for a white group. How do these individuals navigate this, especially if they do not speak the language?
Yeah, that language one is huge. The Asian American community is such a complicated one because, first of all, it represents the biggest continent on the planet. There's so many countries with so many different languages. And all of our immigration stories are different, right? I came here as the child of an academic who came to the United States to pursue a PhD, got a job as a researcher here at UK, right? Educated, middle class, came here with some status and built from there. Now imagine if you're, a Laotian refugee that came here to escape a war, coming here without resources, without language help, without education, things like that. Our experiences are very different. So it's tenuous to begin with to kind of talk about like the Asian American community. My daughter is half white. And in this country, you're identified by the non-white thing that you are. There still is the idea of the one drop rule, that if you're a little bit black or you're a little bit anything, that's what you are, right? And then you have the whole idea of passing, right? So it's a very complicated identity. And I think for us maybe, and for, when I say us, I say folks who are mixed, third culture kids, people like me who kind of feel that second generation, like it's hard for me sometimes to relate to first generation Chinese immigrants. I have more in common with my friend Bill, who I went to school with, whose parents are Vietnamese and he was born here. I have much more in common with him than somebody newly arrived from China, because we have those kind of same shared experiences. So I would say the best thing to do is kind of create and build your own communities as much as possible. And for these existing communities to kind of like widen their lens a little bit and think in terms of, not just like, this is a group for recently arrived Chinese grad students or whatever, that narrow lane of like, this is all we do, and be able to kind of widen it out and see that we're part of a larger community.
Okay, last question. Last question is, excuse me.
Does anybody in the audience here have something? Yeah. You want to let.
Okay,
have,
so the audience, wait one second, let me
Yeah,
finish
yeah,
this
yeah.
one, because it's connected with the local Lexington.
Gotcha.
So what local organizations are currently working to advance the rights and break down discrimination against the AAPI community?
In a place the size of Lexington, there is not a specific Asian American oriented civic or nonprofit group like that. The two groups that I have worked the closest with in recent years are Kentucky Refugee Ministries. They basically help recent arrivals, refugees into the city. They literally pick them up at the airports. They set them up with housing. They set them up with job training, language training. Before COVID hit, I was supposed to go over and do a grocery store walkthrough with some like newly arrived refugees. Like literally, like this is where the vegetables are. This is Kroger brand. That's cheaper than name brand. Look at the per unit price. And so just how to navigate America. My other organization that I work a lot with is Kentucky Equal Justice. They do a lot of low cost and pro bono work for all kinds of issues, but in particular, they have something called the Maxwell Street Legal Clinic, which does low cost immigration work. So basically help people get into this country, help people navigate the system and stay in this country. Yeah, go ahead.
What advice would you have for those of us who are, keeping people informed on the issues, and speaking out when they can, from being like that one? Because a lot of us in our groups are that one. The one person who's like, oh my gosh, this is a problem. What should I do? Like, what advice do you have for those of us to keep us from being like mentally exhausted?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think a lot of us have been like the one in the room, and it is exhausting. It is so tiring. That's a tough one. I think that's also one where, in your group or in your circle or in your friends, I think you can say that. I think you can say like, man, I am tired of being the only one that's informed about stuff and telling you all about stuff. And I'm tired of being the only one that you come to when you have a question about race or about things happening. Like help me out here. Like, do some of your own research. Take some of this on. You know what I mean? Like, the next time somebody has a question, I want you to take that, because there's half the stuff that people ask me about, I have to Google anyway. And so that's my rule is, if you can Google it, go Google it and don't ask me. If it's not on Google, if you're looking for my own personal experience and my own personal outlook, and we have that relationship, then sure. Yeah, that's totally fine. But what you're asking for when you say like, what can we do to help Asians? Or like, what's the deal with the Chinese Exclusion Act? It's like you're asking for my free labor that you can perform yourself. So I would say I believe in radical vulnerability and honesty. So if they are truly your friends and people who should be comrades in arms, say that to them. Say that I am tired. Like, I need some help, y'all. Yes.
Question? Is there a question in the back? Peril.
Hey. This is like the fourth time you come to speak with our International Village students, and you're here to meet with the students. Thank you for doing that. So I know what a movie buff you are. And talk about in media, what kinds of things can we do to really promote having a more diverse opportunity to see films? I mean, I'm so sad because that's plenty of
Kentucky Theater. Yeah.
One of the spaces. So what are your ideas?
Yeah, that's an easy one. Literally, I mean, this is, again, the kind of questions I get asked. I would Google Asian American films 2020 or best Asian American films on Netflix or streaming or whatever theme it is. And you find these really great lists. And I'll say this much, and this especially applies when you're trying to absorb Black art. Every month or every year, it seems like Black History Month hits, and these lists of like, you have to read these 10 books and you have to watch these 10 movies. And the 10 books, 7 of them about slavery and 3 of them are about the civil rights. And it's just like, you got to be kidding me. So when you're seeking this kind of art out, look for the historical stuff, look for the stuff that is important, that may tell a story, but also just look for joy. You know what I mean? If you want to watch a great Asian American film, watch Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. You know what I mean? What's it about? It's about these 2 stoners who are high and trying to go to White Castle. They happen to be Asian American, but that movie is revolutionary because those 2 guys normally would not be 2 Asian guys at all. They would just be 2 white guys and it would just be a normal movie. The fact that they're cast at all, the fact that they don't speak with accents, the fact that the story is not about their Asianness whatsoever is revolutionary and it's joyful. So find those kind of stories, I think. And I think, you know, the more you absorb that kind of stuff, the more empathy that you'll store up. Yeah.
Mr. Wu, this is George.
Yes, sir.
I have sort of 2 questions. Have there been any idea of violence in Kentucky against Asians?
I don't know specifically. I haven't looked at those kind of stats and stuff. And again, you know, reported incidents are not the same as things that happen all the time.
You talked about median income. What about, I mean, my prejudice is lack of education. Are there poor Asians here, or were they, I mean, and why and how did they arrive here? Did they were they illegally imported or something of that nature?
I think.
I suggest that because I remember in my younger days the massage parlors, and they were essentially Asian sex workers. And then, of course, there have been that kind of body still ongoing, including amongst Latino communities.
Yeah, I think immigrants to America come in so many different ways. Some people are trafficked here for various reasons, and some people come here of their own accord. Different countries have different quotas, and you get here by hundreds of different ways. And then, of course, we have refugee settlement, which is determined by the federal government in terms of how many people get to go where. Last 4 years, we've had the lowest refugee numbers let into this country in our recent history. Yeah, there are poor Asians and Asian Americans in this country and in this community for the same reasons that any other community is poor. Lack of opportunity to jobs, lack of education, lack of connection and resources to the community. So again, it's the idea that Asians are not a monolith. If you take, you know, median household income means you throw all these numbers in a bucket and, you know, see where the middle is, right? But that means there are those making millions, and then there are those well below the poverty line. And I think that's it's a step that we need to take immediately to be able to see that both those things exist, that we are not just a single number.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to be mindful of the time. I'm going to give the last question. Oh,
Sorry, I fixed it.
last 1 or 2 questions to Dr. Wright,
Okay.
who is showing up on the screen. Go ahead, Dr. Wright.
Okay, Mr. Wu, mine is not so much a question as it is a comment.
Should I have you mute for 1 second?
Yeah.
That way we can.
Yep.
Mr. Wu, you said so many things.
Dr. Wright, can you ask your question again?
Okay.
We're having a little echo over here.
Okay. Can you hear me okay now? Is it okay now? Okay. Mr. Wu, mine is not so much a question as it is a comment. And that is, as I've heard you speak, so many of the points you made throughout your presentation resonate with me as a scholar of the Afro-American experience, as well as an African-American who lives in this country. And I appreciate how in so many ways you put what Asian Americans have experienced in this country into a larger context of what other people have experienced. And I must share with you, the last comment I want to make is where you said something to the effect when people have thought that you were, quote, one of them, and they've said inappropriate things in your presence. All of my life, I've experienced that where people thought they could tell a joke or could say something that would be inappropriate either about my group or someone else's group. And like you, in every instance, from the time I was young until now, as much as I want to show everybody respect, I have challenged them right there on that. And I think that that's what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to allow people to get away with belittling, whether it's my group or someone else's group. And in fact, it's often more insidious when in my presence, they say something to me about some, quote, other group in that regard. So I thank you so much for that. I'm going to have to talk with Dr. Maskey to find out a way that we can involve you again at the university. I see, well, we had well over 100 people here on the presentation. I wish we had 1,000 or more people tonight. So I thank you, sir, for your time tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Dr. Wright, and thank you, Dan, Mr. Wu. And thank you for all of you who are here in person, and thank you for all of you who attend. We on Zoom. We are way over time, and on behalf of Office of China Initiative, and I want to also thank Karen who helps us, and also our staff who worked very hard to make this into a reality. And I also want to say that we have recorded this session. So we will put the recording with Dan's permission. We're going to put it on our website when it is done. So with that, I would like for you to join me to give Dan another pot of Zoom applause. If you know, people over here. And thank you so much, Dan, again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.